The static breaks at 0347 hours. Not gradually, not with the usual atmospheric interference or the slow crawl of signal degradation that operators learn to recognize. It simply stops mid-frequency, replaced by silence, so complete the operator reaches for his headset to check the connection. The equipment is functioning. Every indicator confirms it. But the absence of sound feels wrong in a way that makes him hesitate before adjusting the dial. When the voice comes through, it's already mid-sentence. No call sign, no identifier, no request for confirmation. Just words, clear and measured, as though the speaker has been transmitting for some time and simply waited for someone to find the frequency. The operator writes down what he hears, one hand steady on the transcription pad. The other motionless on the dial, he no longer wants to turn. The message is 12 seconds long. When it ends, the static returns exactly as it was before. Same density, same frequency pattern, same white noise that had filled the channel for the previous 6 hours. He runs the tape back, checks the timestamp, confirms the frequency log. Everything is recorded. Everything is documented. But the direction-finding equipment shows no source coordinates whatsoever. This kind of research takes considerable time to verify and present accurately. If you appreciate detailed historical documentaries, a subscription supports this work. Radio communication during the Second World War operated under conditions most modern listeners would find almost unimaginable. Frequencies were crowded. Equipment was temperamental, and atmospheric conditions could turn a clear channel into static within minutes. Operators worked in shifts that blurred together, monitoring assigned bands for friendly traffic, enemy intercepts, or the electronic signatures of distant bomber formations. Signal intelligence stations were positioned across multiple theaters, in England, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and throughout continental Europe as Allied forces advanced. Most were isolated, either by design or circumstance, tucked into hillsides or coastal installations where geography favored reception. Operators sat in cramped rooms filled with equipment that generated heat regardless of outside temperature, wearing headsets for hours at a time, transcribing Morse code or monitoring voice channels. The technology was a strange hybrid of precision and improvisation. Receivers could isolate frequencies with remarkable accuracy, but they were sensitive to interference from weather, solar activity, equipment malfunctions, and electronic noise generated by hundreds of other stations. Operators learned to distinguish between types of static, to recognize the acoustic signature of a failing vacuum tube, to identify atmospheric bounce patterns. Direction-finding equipment added another layer of complexity. Multiple stations could triangulate a transmission's origin by measuring signal arrival angle, but the system required careful calibration and worked best with sustained transmissions. Brief messages, weak signals, or unusual atmospheric conditions could produce ambiguous results, or no results at all. Yet the training was rigorous. Operators were taught to distinguish legitimate anomalies from equipment failure, to document unusual activity without interpretation, and to report patterns that might indicate enemy innovation. The logs were detailed. Every frequency change, every signal strength fluctuation, every unexplained transmission was recorded, which is why certain entries, scattered across different stations in different years, presented a problem that no amount of technical expertise seemed to resolve. Transmissions with no identifiable source. Messages that appeared on frequencies with perfect clarity, but produced no direction-finding coordinates. Signals that exhibited none of the characteristics of atmospheric bounce, repeater relay, or ionospheric reflection. The official explanation focused on equipment limitations, unusual propagation conditions, or operator error. These were reasonable conclusions. Radio communication was an imperfect science, and unexplained phenomena were common enough that most were simply logged and forgotten. But the logs themselves, when examined collectively rather than individually, suggested something the official explanations didn't quite address. The anomalies were too similar. The descriptions, written by different operators in different locations who had no contact with one another, used remarkably consistent language. And the transcriptions, when compared, showed patterns that equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference shouldn't produce among radio operators, particularly those stationed at remote or isolated posts. Certain stories circulated with the persistence of folklore, not officially and rarely in written form, but in the quiet conversations during shift changes or informal gatherings where technical personnel compared experiences. There were reports of what operators called ghost transmissions, signals that appear without warning, transmitted what seemed to be coherent messages, and vanished just as suddenly. The term wasn't meant literally. It was shorthand for something the official terminology didn't adequately describe. These reports shared common elements. The signals were described as unusually clear, often clearer than legitimate military traffic on adjacent frequencies. They appeared most frequently during early morning hours, typically between 0300 and 0500. They were brief, rarely exceeding 30 seconds, and they ended abruptly rather than fading out gradually. What made them noteworthy to operators wasn't just the unusual propagation characteristics. It was the content. The messages weren't encrypted, though they also weren't in plain language exactly. Operators described them as sounding like standard military communication, proper radio procedure, appropriate terminology, correct format, but lacking specific identifying information. No unit designations that matched known formations. No call signs that appeared in any registry. Some believe these were elaborate enemy deception operations. This was a reasonable assumption. Both sides employed sophisticated electronic warfare tactics. Others thought they were hearing cross-channel interference from distant stations, signals that had bounced off the ionosphere at unusual angles. This too was plausible, but there was a third category of explanation that circulated less openly. These were transmissions that seemed to respond to being monitored, not immediately, and not in any way that could be definitively proven, but with timing and content that felt deliberately interactive rather than coincidentally intercepted. An operator would note an unusual signal, adjust his equipment to isolate the frequency, and the transmission would change in character. A pattern would emerge in otherwise random-sounding content. A pause would occur at moments when the operator moved to transcribe. These observations were almost never officially reported because there was no framework for reporting them. Equipment either functioned or malfunctioned. Signals either conformed to known propagation physics or they didn't. What gave these informal reports weight was their distribution across different theaters and different branches of service. Navy operators in the Pacific reported experiences that mirrored those of Army signals intelligence personnel in Europe. RAF radio operators in North Africa described phenomena identical to what their counterparts in England had logged. Yet the descriptions remained consistent. And in the years following the war, when veterans began comparing experiences more openly, that consistency became harder to explain through conventional means alone. The transmissions, according to those who encountered them, followed patterns that didn't quite match any single explanation. They appeared most frequently on frequencies just outside standard military bands, not far enough to suggest random interference, but slightly offset in ways that suggested deliberate positioning. The signal strength remained constant throughout rather than fluctuating as atmospheric conditions typically caused, and they ended with a precision that felt mechanical, as though timed to the second. The voices, when voices were present, were described as unremarkable. No distinctive accents indicating national origin. No emotional inflection suggesting stress or urgency. The delivery was professional, measured, exactly what one would expect from a trained radio operator. But the content itself resisted easy categorization. Some transmissions consisted of coordinates, not encoded, simply stated as latitude and longitude pairs with no additional context. When operators later checked these coordinates, they sometimes corresponded to actual locations, often maritime positions in open ocean or remote geographic points with no strategic significance. Other transmissions contained what sounded like status reports, equipment readings, weather observations, personnel counts. But the numbers didn't align with any known operation, and the terminology, while military in character, combined elements from different branches and different nations in ways that made no tactical sense. Still others were even stranger. Sequences of numbers that weren't coordinates, words that weren't quite code but weren't plain language either, references to locations or units that appeared in no official record. Historically, unexplained radio phenomena weren't unprecedented. During the First World War, operators had reported mysterious signals. In the decades following World War II, radio enthusiasts documented thousands of anomalous transmissions, number stations broadcasting encrypted sequences, unidentified beacons transmitting on frequencies, serving no apparent purpose, signals that seemed to originate from locations where no transmitter existed. But wartime reports had a different character. They came from trained personnel operating calibrated equipment under controlled conditions. The operators weren't hobbyists. They were professionals whose job required them to distinguish between normal interference and genuine anomalies. The term phantom transmission eventually became semi-official shorthand, used in technical discussions to describe signals that exhibited characteristics inconsistent with known propagation physics. It didn't explain the phenomenon. It simply acknowledged that the phenomenon existed and that existing explanations were inadequate. What made certain transmissions particularly difficult to explain wasn't just their content or unusual propagation characteristics. It was their apparent awareness of the listener. Operators reported instances where transmission would pause at the exact moment they began transcribing, resume when they stopped, or shift frequency just as direction-finding equipment achieved lock. These observations were difficult to document because they bordered on subjective interpretation. But coincidence, when it occurred repeatedly across different stations with different operators using different equipment, became statistically unlikely enough that even skeptical personnel began to question whether something else might be happening. One detail appeared with enough frequency to warrant attention. Transmissions that included specific temporal references, dates, times, durations that were accurate when checked against official records, but which reference events or operations that were classified at the time of transmission. How a phantom signal with no identifiable source could contain information that even the operator listening didn't have access to was a question that remained unanswered in any official capacity. The first documented report that fits the pattern appeared in June 1943. Transcribed by a Royal Navy Signals operator stationed at a coastal listening post in Cornwall. The operator's log entry is unremarkable until 0318 hours, when he notes a signal appearing on 4.2 megahertz, a frequency that saw almost no use at that hour. The signal strength was recorded as S9, exceptionally clear. He logged the time, tuned his receiver to isolate the frequency, and reached for his transcription pad. The voice was male, speaking English with what he described as neutral pronunciation, no regional accent he could identify. The delivery was calm, professional, exactly what one would expect from routine naval communication. The message consisted of coordinates, followed by a time reference, followed by what sounded like a casualty report. The operator wrote it down verbatim. The coordinates placed a position roughly 400 miles west of Ireland, in open Atlantic waters. The time reference was 0140 hours. Nearly 2 hours before the transmission, he was monitoring. The casualty report listed 17 personnel lost, 3 wounded, ship's name given as a designation he didn't recognize. He attempted to engage direction-finding equipment, but the bearing indicator remained stationary, showing no directional component. But the signal wasn't weak. It was one of the clearest he'd monitored all night. The transmission ended at 0319 hours, exactly 60 seconds after it began. He immediately contacted his supervising officer and reported the intercept. The coordinates were checked against known convoy routes. The ship designation was run through fleet registries. Nothing matched. 3 days later, a convoy approximately 400 miles west of Ireland reported coming under U-boat attack during early morning hours. The engagement occurred at 0140 hours. A merchant vessel was torpedoed. Casualty count, 17 dead, 3 wounded. The ship's designation matched the name given in the transmission. The operator had logged 72 hours earlier. His report was annotated, filed, and classified. The official explanation suggested he had misheard a legitimate distress transmission during the actual attack and confused the timestamp due to fatigue. But the operator's original log remained unchanged in the archive. The timestamp was clear, the transcription was exact, and the transmission he'd monitored had occurred 2 days before the attack it described. He continued his duties for the remainder of the war, monitoring assigned frequencies, logging routine traffic, filing reports through proper channels. He never officially questioned the explanation he'd been given, but in the decades following the war, when interviewed by researchers investigating anomalous wartime radio phenomena, he was asked whether he believed the official explanation. His answer, according to the transcript, was 9 seconds of silence. Then, "I know what I heard. I know when I heard it. I know what the log says." He died in 1987, and his personal papers contained a single envelope marked with the date of the original transmission. Inside was his original transcription, the official report he'd filed, and the classified response he'd received. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting confirmed as his own, was a single sentence he'd never included in any official documentation. "The voice knew I was listening." The conditions under which radio operators worked during wartime created environments particularly conducive to perceptual distortion and cognitive strain. Isolation was nearly universal. Signals intelligence stations were deliberately positioned away from command centers, often in locations chosen for geographic features that enhanced radio reception rather than habitability. Operators worked in small teams, sometimes alone, for shifts that extended well beyond normal duty hours. Sleep deprivation was endemic. Critical intercept operations required round-the-clock coverage, and personnel shortages meant operators frequently worked double shifts. The effects of sustained sleep loss on perception, memory, and judgment have been extensively documented. Decreased sensory accuracy, increased susceptibility to pattern recognition errors, degraded ability to distinguish between actual events and mental artifacts. The equipment demanded intense, sustained concentration. Monitoring weak signals through heavy static required operators to listen so carefully that some reported being able to hear electromagnetic interference that wasn't actually audible, a phenomenon where prolonged sensory focus produces phantom perceptions. Environmental factors added strain. Operators worked in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, often in extreme temperatures, surrounded by equipment generating heat and electromagnetic fields. The sensory environment was deliberately limited. Dim lighting, minimal external sound, restricted movement. These conditions could produce hallucinations, particularly auditory ones. Research on sensory deprivation demonstrates that the human brain, when deprived of normal sensory input, will sometimes generate its own voices where none exist, patterns, and random noise. This explanation accounts for many reported anomalies. An operator working alone for 18 hours in a darkened room, listening to white noise, straining to detect weak signals, would be exactly the kind of observer most susceptible to perceptual error. Add the psychological dimension of wartime service. Constant awareness of danger, knowledge that missed intercepts could cost lives, pressure to maintain perfect accuracy despite impossible conditions, and the foundation for stress-induced misperception becomes even stronger. From this perspective, phantom transmissions are entirely explicable. They represent the predictable outcome of placing trained observers in conditions specifically designed to maximize perceptual strain. This explanation is compelling and supported by substantial research in cognitive psychology and perceptual neuroscience. It accounts for most reports adequately, but it doesn't account for the transcriptions themselves. Hallucinations don't typically produce detailed, internally consistent information that later proves accurate. Perceptual errors don't usually generate content that multiple independent observers record identically, and stress-induced misperception does explain how information that wasn't publicly available appears in documented logs. The psychological explanation remains valid. It almost certainly accounts for the majority of reported anomalies, but the word almost creates a space where something else might exist. The account that follows was documented by a U.S. Army Signals Intelligence operator stationed in the European theater during the winter of 1944. His service record indicates nothing unusual. Standard training, competent evaluations, no disciplinary issues. He served until war's end, received honorable discharge, and returned to civilian life as an electrical engineer. The incident occurred during a routine monitoring shift at a signals intelligence station in eastern France. The station's primary mission was intercepting German military communications, but operators also monitored Allied frequencies for potential security breaches. At approximately 0337 hours, a signal appeared on a frequency allocated to tactical air-ground communication. The operator noted it immediately because the frequency should have been silent. No air operations were scheduled, and ground units maintained radio silence. The signal strength was unusually high, not just clear, but stronger than transmissions from stations within 10 miles. He checked his equipment, confirmed the frequency, and began standard intercept procedure. The voice spoke English with an American accent, using proper radio procedure, reading what sounded like a weather report, visibility parameters, cloud ceiling, wind speed and direction, temperature, barometric pressure, standard information, delivered in standard format. Except the coordinates given place the observation point approximately 60 miles beyond current Allied positions, in territory under German control. His training dictated a specific response. Continue monitoring, complete transcription, report through channels. He did exactly that, despite growing awareness that something violated basic operational security. The transmission continued for approximately 90 seconds. Then the voice stopped mid-word. Not paused, not interrupted by static. Simply stopped, as though the speaker had been cut off mid-syllable. The operator waited, listening to the now silent frequency. After 30 seconds, he noted the time, marked the transcription as incomplete, and reached for the direction-finding report. The equipment showed no bearing, no angle of arrival, no indication the signal had come from any particular direction. He double-checked the calibration, ran a test signal, confirmed the system functioned correctly. It did. The direction-finding equipment worked perfectly on every other frequency. Only the one transmission produced null results. He filed his report through proper channels. The report was reviewed, annotated, and classified. 2 weeks later, Allied forces advanced through the area where the coordinates had placed the observation point. Reconnaissance teams documented what they found. A small stone building on a hillside with clear sight lines, abandoned but showing signs of recent occupation. On a wooden table inside, they found what appeared to be a makeshift weather station. Improvised instruments, a logbook with entries in English. The final entry in the logbook matched the transmission the operator had monitored, word for word, down to the incomplete final word where the transmission had stopped. The logbook was photographed, cataloged, and included in the reconnaissance report. It was also classified. No official explanation was provided for how a weather station in German-held territory had transmitted on Allied frequencies. No explanation addressed how the operator had monitored a transmission that, according to the logbook states, had been made 3 weeks before he heard it. The operator raised no questions through official channels. He served out his deployment and returned home. Decades later, when contacted by researchers, he agreed to review the original documentation. The transcription he'd made matched the logbook entry exactly. The timestamp on his report was unambiguous. The dates didn't reconcile. When asked what he thought had happened, he was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think I heard something that was already finished. I don't know how. I don't know why, but I know I heard it." What made reports like these more difficult to dismiss was their occurrence across different contexts, different observers, and different theaters of operation. A Royal Air Force radio operator station in Burma reported monitoring a distress call on a frequency assigned to transport aircraft. The transmission included aircraft identification, position coordinates, and a report of engine failure. Direction-finding equipment indicated the signal originated from mountainous terrain with no known Allied flight operations. He logged the report and forwarded it through proper channels. Search and rescue operations were initiated. No wreckage was found. No aircraft matching the identification was missing. 6 months later, a transport aircraft flying that exact route experienced engine failure at the exact coordinates given in the original transmission. The crew successfully executed emergency procedures and returned to base. No distress call was made. The original operator's log entry remained in official records, timestamp verified, coordinates exact. A U.S. Navy radio operator aboard a destroyer in the Pacific intercepted what he logged as an encrypted transmission on a Japanese naval frequency. The signal was recorded, documented, and forwarded for analysis. The decryption team determined the transmission wasn't encrypted. It was garbled, possibly due to atmospheric interference. But when parsed through cryptanalysis, patterns emerged. The content appeared to be tactical communication between Japanese naval units. Position reports, status updates, movement coordination. The details matched known Japanese operational procedures. 3 days later, Allied naval forces engaged a Japanese formation at coordinates that matched those given in the intercepted transmission. The engagement unfolded almost exactly as the communication had suggested. The original operator was commended for the intercept. No official note addressed why the transmission had been received 72 hours before the events it described. These accounts, and dozens of others documented in military archives, share common elements beyond their unusual temporal characteristics. The transmissions were professionally formatted, using proper procedure and appropriate terminology. They provided specific, verifiable information rather than vague content. They were documented by trained personnel operating calibrated equipment according to established protocols. And they were almost never investigated beyond initial reporting, typically being classified and archived without further analysis. The pattern wasn't limited to specific branches of service or particular geographic regions. Navy, Army, and Air Force personnel reported similar experiences across European, Pacific, and North African theaters. The consistency of reported characteristics, signal clarity, absence of direction-finding data, temporal anomalies appear regardless of equipment type or local atmospheric conditions. What made these patterns particularly striking was their distribution across time. Reports appeared throughout the war years, from 1941 through 1945, with no apparent clustering during specific periods. In the decades following the war, researchers attempting to compile comprehensive documentation faced significant obstacles. Many records remain classified. Personnel who might have provided additional context had died or couldn't be located. But enough documentation survived to establish that whatever phenomenon operators were encountering, it was encountered repeatedly by different individuals in different circumstances, with results that were documented and preserved in official records. The question wasn't whether these reports existed. They did. The question was what they represented. The phenomenon of unexplained radio transmissions has attracted substantial analytical attention from researchers in physics, atmospheric science, and electrical engineering. The primary explanation focuses on ionospheric propagation anomalies. Radio waves can reflect off ionospheric layers in ways that dramatically extend transmission range and alter apparent signal origin. Under specific conditions, signals bounce between ionospheric layers and Earth's surface multiple times, arriving from unexpected directions or appearing to originate from locations far from their actual source. This accounts for many observed characteristics: high signal strength despite no apparent nearby transmitter, directional ambiguity that confuses direction-finding equipment, and reception of signals on frequencies that shouldn't reach particular geographic locations. Temporal anomalies could result from atmospheric distortion affecting signal timing, operator error in timestamp documentation, or coincidental similarity between intercepted content and later events. Psychological explanations remain relevant. Pattern recognition bias. The human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data could account for perceived similarities between intercepted transmissions and subsequent events. Confirmation bias could explain why operators remember ambiguous transmissions that seem to align with later occurrences while forgetting the vast majority that show no such correlation. Equipment-based explanations also merit consideration. Radio receivers at sensitivity limits sometimes produce artifacts resembling legitimate signals. Vacuum tube equipment can generate internal noise that trained operators might interpret as actual transmissions. Cross-modulation, harmonic interference, and local electromagnetic sources can all produce seemingly anomalous signal characteristics. These explanations are not speculative. They represent well-documented physical phenomena, yet when applied to specific documented cases, each encounters difficulties. Ionospheric propagation anomalies typically produce signal distortion, fading, frequency shifts, temporal spreading. The documented transmissions were consistently described as exceptionally clear. Direction-finding equipment can be fooled by ionospheric reflection, but the pattern would vary with atmospheric conditions. The documented cases show consistent null results across different times, locations, and atmospheric states. Psychological explanations require that trained operators, operating under strict protocols, consistently misperceive random noise as coherent communication and misrecord timestamps despite verification. While individual errors certainly occur, the documented cases involve multiple independent operators producing remarkably similar reports without coordination. Equipment artifacts should be identifiable through technical analysis. Vacuum tube noise has distinctive characteristics. Cross-modulation produces predictable frequency relationships. The documented anomalies don't consistently match these signatures. The strongest conventional explanation combines all three. Unusual atmospheric conditions produce reception of distant signals under circumstances that confuse direction finding. Cognitive biases lead operators to remember ambiguous transmissions that later seem prophetic, and equipment limitations prevent proper signal analysis. This composite explanation is reasonable, parsimonious, and supported by established science. But certain details remain problematic. Transmissions containing specific, verifiable information that proves accurate when checked against later events. Multiple independent logs documenting identical content. Temporal patterns that hold when controlled for time zones, operator error margins, and documentation procedures. These details don't definitively rule out conventional explanations. They simply reduce the probability that conventional explanations account for all observations. The last account worth presenting was documented by a signals intelligence operator in the closing months of the war in Europe. The location was a mobile intelligence station attached to advancing Allied forces. The operator was experienced, with over 2 years of continuous field deployment and a service record indicating exceptional competence. At 0412 hours, he noted a signal appearing on a frequency that had shown no activity for 6 hours. The transmission began without preamble. No call sign, no station identification, just a voice speaking German in formal, educated pronunciation. The content was a casualty list. Names, ranks, unit designations, cause of death or injury, location, time of incident. The operator's German was fluent. He began recording the names as they were transmitted, following standard protocols. The list continued for nearly 3 minutes. Dozens of names, different ranks from different units, casualties from different causes. The transmission maintained perfect clarity throughout. No static, no signal degradation. The voice was steady, professional, showing no emotion. At minute 3, the operator noticed something that made him stop transcribing. One of the names matched his own, not a similar name. His exact name, including middle initial, pronounced correctly. The rank was correct. The unit designation was correct. The listed cause was equipment accident. Location was given as current station coordinates. Time was listed as 0420 hours. Current time was 0415 hours. The operator's log entry shows a gap at this point. The transcription stops mid-word. The timestamp jumps forward. When notation resumes, It's after 0430 hours, and handwriting shows subtle changes consistent with acute stress. According to official records, an equipment malfunction occurred at the station at approximately 0421 hours. A receiver unit experienced catastrophic failure. Internal electrical fire caused by short circuit. The unit was destroyed. The operator was positioned approximately 2 meters away. He was not injured. The incident report describes rapid response by station personnel who extinguished the fire before it spread. Total duration, less than 90 seconds. No casualties. Minimal equipment loss. Incident classified as routine malfunction. The operator completed his shift as scheduled. His subsequent service record shows no anomalies. He received standard discharge and returned to civilian life. He never filed an official report about the transmission he'd been monitoring when the equipment failed. The transcription he'd been writing was destroyed in the electrical fire, but his personal diary, discovered after his death and donated to military archives, contained an entry dated to that night. The entry is brief. It describes monitoring a casualty list transmitted in German. It notes his surprise at hearing his own name. It records predicted time and the actual time equipment failure occurred. The final sentence reads, "I don't know if I heard it because it was going to happen or if it happened because I heard it." The diary entry ends there. The operator died of natural causes in 1991 at age 73. According to family members, he never spoke about his wartime service in any detail. Radio communication at its foundation is the transmission of information across distance through electromagnetic radiation. The physics are understood. The technology is mature. Yet within this domain, there exist documented cases that resist straightforward explanation, not because explanations don't exist. They do, grounded in solid physics and psychology, but because when applied to specific cases, carefully preserved in archives and verified through sources, gaps remain. Transmissions received before they were sent. Information appearing in intercepts that wasn't available at the time. Coordinates that prove accurate before the events they described. These gaps may represent incomplete information. Archives are imperfect. Documentation has limitations. Memory remains fallible. Or they may represent something else. The question remains open not because answers are impossible, but because evidence itself remains ambiguous. Conventional explanations coexist with details that those explanations don't quite accommodate. What the operators heard, sitting in darkened rooms with headphones isolating them from everything except static and signals, cannot be reconstructed. The experience of monitoring frequencies in early morning hours, alone, listening so carefully that sound becomes something felt, that is lost to time. What remains are the logs, the transcriptions, the timestamps, and the silence that followed when equipment was turned off at shift's end, when headphones were removed, when the operator stepped outside and tried to reconcile what he'd heard with what he knew should be possible. The phenomenon, whatever it was, hasn't been resolved. Reports continue sporadically. Amateur operators occasionally document similar experiences. Researchers note anomalies. The patterns persist. Perhaps there are transmissions that arrive before they're sent. Perhaps there are signals that know they're being monitored. Perhaps radio communication, under circumstances we don't understand, sometimes functions in ways our models don't predict. Or perhaps nothing unusual is occurring. Just trained observers operating equipment under difficult conditions, occasionally perceiving patterns that don't exist. The archives remain open. The documentation continues to be analyzed. Former operators, in their remaining years, occasionally agree to interviews. The question hasn't been answered. It may never be, but somewhere in the frequencies between stations, in the quiet hours before dawn, operators still listen. And sometimes they hear transmissions with no sender,